The Friesland is a one-of-a-kind destroyer. There's quite literally nothing else like it. It's also one of the two new Premium Tier 7 destroyers that you can choose as your reward for the ongoing October 2021 campaign. Hello, I am Xarkun, and this is World of Warships Legends. Today we're going to take our first in-depth look at the Friesland. We'll talk about the reasons why you might want to choose the Friesland over its campaign alternative, and we'll also talk about the reasons why you might not want to choose the Friesland. As usual, we'll be taking a look at my mod selection, commander build, and then we'll talk about the stats and how the ship plays when we jump into the gameplay segment. I'll say before we dig in that the Friesland is probably a higher skill cap ship than the alternative Lo Yang, and you probably need to be pretty good at the game to get the most out of it. That said, I don't think the Friesland has an equal when it comes to pure fun. So with that in mind, let's get started. And first up, as usual, my mod selection. Aiming systems, steering gears, concealment in the 3rd slot, and main battery reload in the 4th slot. I went with steering gears here because I think the rudder shift is a little bit unresponsive without it, but you could probably do just as well with propulsion, although I think the ship actually accelerates quite nicely without it. My commander build is, of course, Jerzy Swirsky. He's the only commander available for this ship, and if you don't have him, getting this ship will give you this commander, which may be valuable to you and may be an argument for choosing the Friesland over the Lo Yang. Note that I have Perceptive selected instead of Twist and Track, though. That's because the turret traverse on the Friesland's guns is perfectly fine. You don't need to buff it. And Perceptive gives you a bonus to your hit points. It reduces incoming damage and also increases the range at which you detect incoming torpedoes. Now, let's break the Friesland stats down in a different way than I usually do. We'll talk about the good, the mixed, and the bad. So starting off with the good, the first thing may be obvious to you. The Friesland has 20,260 hit points with my rank 16 William Sims as a commander inspiration, putting it up in the league with Tashkent, Z-23, and Akizuki for a very robust Tier 7 destroyer hit points pool. Keep in mind all of these stats that I'm going to give you are influenced by my commander build and the mod selection I showed you in the beginning of the video. So, a lot of hit points on this ship, and that is pretty nice when it comes to trading with other destroyers at this tier. Speaking of trading with other destroyers at this tier, the highlight of this ship is, of course, the guns. Now, you might not think that just looking at the raw number of guns on paper. There are only 4 of them, and they are 120 millimeters in size. Same caliber, I think, as the British destroyers. They have a range of 11.2 kilometers when running the Epic Booster flag, and they have an absolutely insane rate of fire. I've got the reload down to 1.5 seconds. Since I've selected the mortar skill on Swirsky, the HE alpha is 1,881 with an 8% fire chance, which on guns that reload this quickly is actually fantastic. This thing starts a lot of fires. And the AP alpha with mortar is 2,258. This means that the Friesland has a potential HE DPM with this build of 300,960 and a potential AP DPM of 361,280, which I think gives it the highest potential DPM stats of literally any ship in the game, regardless of class. So the guns of the Friesland are its bread and butter, especially because it must rely solely on them. It does not, unlike all other destroyers, have access to torpedoes, and more on that in a little bit. Another highlight of the ship, the AA defenses. Those are probably quite excellent as well. The main battery doubles as AA protection, has a 5.2 km range, and does an average DPS of 122. Although I have yet to see this in action, because in all the games I've played, I've not run across a CV. These guns, though, like I said, they also double as AA, but when you shoot them at surface ships, Oh boy, take a look at the damage and the fires we're starting on this Bismarck as he turns broadside. And in fact, I don't know if we switch to the armor piercing here, but we will at some point in this game, and you'll see that it's pretty monstrous. Anyway, what else is good about the Friesland? Well, the Friesland also comes with 2 charges of what is ostensibly long-lasting American destroyer smoke. So you can sit in this smoke for quite a while, like you can in the American destroyers. And it has a hydroacoustic search capable of detecting ships at 4.4 km. It also comes with an engine boost, which it does not have on the PC version of this game, and instead has the defensive AA consumable. You could actually look at this edition of the engine boost consumable as a buff from PC to console, honestly, as it helps mitigate one of the Friesland's major downsides. But certainly the guns and the hit points pool, those are very, very good indeed on this ship. And you can see with this AP, by the way, we're able to easily finish off this Bismarck. First blood medal, we've done 48,000 damage in a couple of seconds, I think almost entirely against that Bismarck and the ZF6 that's out here. Let's move on to the mixed things about this ship, though. It's got a 37.1 knot top speed with the Epic booster flag, and that's not especially fast for a Tier 7 destroyer, particularly one that is a dedicated gunboat. Makes it more like the Akizuki in terms of handling than the Tashkent, but the addition of the speed boost mitigates the rather pedestrian speed by allowing you to travel over 40 knots when the speed boost is active. 620-meter turning circle feels tight enough, but it is perhaps a little clumsy. And the 3-point-second rudder shift with the rudder shift mod, while not god tier like the American destroyer rudder shift, it's certainly fine. Concealment is likewise kind of mixed. I've got the Friesland detection at 6 kilometers because of my selection of the mortar skill. You could, of course, lower it by not choosing mortar, and you'd probably find yourself somewhere in the 5.4 km range, and that's pretty good. But you will be outspotted by the likes of IJN destroyers and, people running ridiculous concealment builds. I kind of like the 6 km concealment, though, because it forces you to play this ship a little bit more back and not overextend into dangerous areas, which I think is key to doing well with this ship, by the way. So the concealment is honestly not that much of a concern to me. But now on to the downsides of this ship. The bad, as they say. The Friesland has no access to torpedoes at all. This means you will not have the big hitting alpha to quickly dispatch with enemies when you might really need to. Whether the monstrous potential main battery DPM makes up for the lack of torpedoes is probably a question, honestly, of how good you are at playing gunboats like this. The biggest downside with no torpedoes is, of course, that there is absolutely nothing to prevent cruisers or battleships from rushing you, especially when you're sitting in smoke. They don't need to fear any torpedoes from you, so they can rush into your smoke, potentially kill you, and you are, of course, not especially fast, so if you're not paying attention, you might find yourself unable to escape in time. Although destroyers might be hesitant to push into your smoke because of that sonar, which again has a spotting range of 4.4 kilometers, so you can see them fairly far out, and the monstrous reload time on this HE and the DPM, you can just melt destroyers very, very quickly if they do try to push your smoke, but you probably aren't going to deter a battleship or a cruiser. As far as how do you play this ship effectively? Well, I find myself playing the Friesland almost very like a tiny light cruiser with an especially limited gun range. Kind of like a Cleveland, honestly, without radar. I find myself utilizing the island cover a lot, and basically trying to farm ships that want to push into areas like capture circles or other important areas on the map. The fire chance I found is sometimes enough to deter many battleships from actually pushing in. They turn right around as if it's a Cleveland spamming HE at them. And the AP DPM, like I said, absolutely filthy. Individual shell hits, when you look at these shells making contact with the enemy, they might not yield big numbers on their own, but consider the fact that you're almost literally firing every second, and then all that damage really starts to add up, especially if you can stack perma-fires on top of it. Now, the downside, of course, with these guns is that they are 120 millimeters, so I think that only means they can probably pen over 19 millimeters of armor with their high explosive, which means when you're shooting at cruisers and battleships at the higher tiers, you're probably only going to be able to damage them in the superstructure with the HE. On PC, of course, you can use the IFHE skill to get increased penetration, and the equivalent of that would be like the evil sparks on Kurita. Personally, I'd like to be able to use such a skill in order to see if the increase in consistent damage just from HE shell penetrations is a better way to go. But even without it, this ship is a fearsome damage dealer, particularly with the fires. And if you're shooting at battleships, you should be aiming at the superstructure and really only trying to light fires. But if they give you broadside, switch to that armor piercing and you will see terror. That is what you will see. Take a look at this. I mean, again, these individual shell hits, they don't look like especially a lot, but we're getting 2K salvos sometimes, 1K. It all adds up very quickly. And this Nelson, I mean, he didn't have a lot of hit points left, but he's about to have 0 hit points left. Somebody else is able to take out the kill. And throughout the entire course of this game, we really have managed to rack up almost 100,000 damage now with the guns. I'm sure that if you can find positions that are very good, and you've got a lot of enemy ships pushing in at one time, you could rack up even more damage. And in fact, we are going to rack up more damage against the last 2 remaining Nelsons that are still floating. Again, with the AP, the Nelson is a little bit angled. We are getting some ricochets, but when we hit the superstructure near the back of his ship, well, you can see that we are getting pretty good penetrations indeed. And of course, this works out very well against cruisers. And if some cruiser wants to get especially close to your smoke screen and maybe maneuvers in a bit of a potato-like way to give you broadside at close range, well, then this AP really becomes monstrous, and you can melt cruisers just as quickly as you can melt destroyers. In fact, I think speaking of melting destroyers, I think if you were to take this Friesland toe-to-toe with any destroyer in this game, except perhaps the Khabarovsk, in a one-on-one fight where torpedoes didn't come into play and take you out, I think you would win a one-on-one gunfight against pretty much any destroyer. And I say maybe not the Khabarovsk simply because of that very trolly 50 millimeters of armor plating, which you cannot penetrate with this high explosive, and you would need to switch to AP. Here's a half-health Nelson, by the way. We'll see how much we can take away from him. We are in a bit of a bind, though. Like I said, here's one of the downsides of the Friesland. It does not have torpedoes, so this Nelson, there's nothing to stop him from pushing into me. And because I really wasn't paying attention to the map to see him coming, well, with my kind of slow speed, I'm not going to be able to disengage very effectively. On the bright side, this game is pretty much a guaranteed win. That Nelson is the last ship left standing, so even if I go down, which I'm going to because the Nelson's HE is crazy, well, we're still going to win. But there is the downside. That is something you have to be careful of, and that's something you should keep in mind if you're facing a battleship, or if you're facing a Friesland in your battleship. There is no reason for you to not push into its smoke and kill it. You can, and you don't have to worry about torpedoes. The only thing you have to worry about is getting set on fire a crap ton of times on the way in, and that might be very damaging to you indeed. Anyway, there is our first look at the Tier 7 Friesland. Pan-European destroyer. Don't know if I mentioned that. It is Dutch, too, but doesn't get the Dutch voiceover with Swirsky. I think it's still the Polish one. Pretty good game on our part, I'd say. 122,000 damage done, 3,000 base XP. This is a fun ship, and this is the one I'm going to choose for the record. But we'll look at the alternative, the Lo Yang, tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.